My name's Lindsay Johnson. I am a climatologist here at the National Drought Mitigation Center, as well as an author of the U.S. Drought Monitor, along with my colleagues Curtis and Brian, who are also here at the Drought Mitigation Center, who are also authors of the Drought Monitor. So today we're just going to go through kind of what is the Drought Monitor, how is it made, and we're going to have some Q&A at the end. All the slides will be shared in an email afterwards, along with the recorded presentation and questions asked. So we will go ahead and get started. As I said, Curtis is a climatologist at the National Drought Mitigation Center and will be talking you through the process today.
Right. Thanks, Lindsay, and thank you for the introduction. And just want to say first, thank you everyone for being here. This is a fun topic for me to talk about and for all of us to answer questions about. And as Lindsay said, please feel free to put any questions you might have in the Q&A box rather than the chat for this. And if you would, maybe you can keep your camera off too. That might help things run a little bit more smoothly since we do have quite a few people on the call today. All right, so we're going to be talking about the United States Drought Monitor. So we're going to be talking about what it is, what data it communicates, what information we're trying to communicate through it, and then the process of how it gets made. And again, Lindsay and Brian and I are all authors on this, so we can speak with some firsthand experience to that process. So we'll go ahead and get started. So first off, we've been trying to monitor droughts in terms of their spatial coverage and their intensity for quite a long time. This is an old map from the USDA from 1934 in the middle of the Dust Bowl. So I won't spend too much time on this slide, but just want to call your attention to the way that USDA was monitoring droughts back in the 30s was they were trying to measure the spatial coverage of drought conditions, but the primary way by which they were measuring drought was what type of impact is it having on people and the land, and we're somewhat limited to that. As we move forward in time, into the 80s, we started getting a bit more quantitative in terms of how we measure drought with numbers and statistics and weather and climate and hydrology data. So some of you on this call probably have heard of, and some not, that's okay, but the Palmer Drought Severity Index. So this is a long-term drought severity index from Palmer back in 1987, showing general moist conditions in the Central Plains into the Southwest, and then pretty significant levels of dryness in the Western United States, and dryness but less significant in parts of the Mid-Atlantic and Midwest parts of the United States. So again, we're still seeing the drought monitor kind of nascent development here where we are showing intensity of drought and the spatial coverage, but now we're starting to use some climate data to quantify that relative to these locations. However, this map is just a map of the Palmer Drought Severity Index, which has its own strengths and weaknesses and certainly has its own blind spots in terms of what it's good at measuring and what it's not good at capturing. So as we move forward into the present day, this is what the current drought monitor map, which these have been around since the year 2000, will look like. So you can find this on droughtmonitor.unl.edu is the primary way to find it. If you just Google US Drought Monitor, you will find it there too. Several different sources. Again, the primary one is droughtmonitor.unl.edu. So a few main things that I'd like to draw your attention to here on this map. The first is the colors on the map. So the progressively warmer colors are showing higher intensity of drought. Now, we'll get into exactly how this works and what it means soon, but intensity of drought on the drought monitor is specifically talking about drought intensity relative to a location's weather and climate history. So therefore, it's always relative to what's normal for a particular location. So what constitutes drought is going to be different for different climates and locations. But suffice it to say here, the warmer colors, the more red colors you see on the map here mean that dryness that is occurring in these locations are is more unusual for that particular location, statistically speaking. I'd also like to draw your attention to the letters L, SL, or S that you see at various points on the map here. So first, if you look in the lower left-hand corner, you'll see a letter S pointing to a couple of different areas in Alaska. So what that's showing is, and this is a little bit more qualitative, but we're identifying the drought areas in Alaska right now as primarily short-term in nature. So the type of drought data that we look at that is pointing to, hey, it's pretty dry, is mostly data describing conditions in the short term. Thus, the impacts that are occurring from the dryness there right now are primarily impacts that you would expect in that area to occur from short-term drought, usually 6 months or so or less. If you look at the area from southern Utah into Arizona and New Mexico and parts of southwest Texas and then around the Midland, Odessa, and Lubbock area, you'll see a couple L labels with a black outline around that. That's showing primarily long-term drought data. So in the short term, conditions may actually be not very dry or even normal or wetter than normal, but there's still a long-term, significant enough dry signal and impact still occurring from a longer term drought, usually at or above 6 months, that we still want to denote that on the map, but we're going to label that as primary long term. You'll see a lot of SLs on the map here. Hopefully that's intuitive. That's communicating that we're seeing both short and long-term impacts from these drought areas. Finally, the tan and warmer colors from that are moderate to exceptional drought. D0 or abnormal dryness, the yellow that you see on the map is, we don't technically consider that drought. That category is used to signify areas that may be going into or maybe coming out of drought. We don't define it strictly speaking as drought. I'll get into what the specific categories mean in terms of their statistics in a few minutes. So a little bit about the US Drought Monitor. So it's part of a, well, now four-way partnership between the National Drought Mitigation Center, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, or NOAA, as you've probably heard of them, parent organization of the National Weather Service, the U.S. Department of Agriculture, and just recently, NASA has come into the fold as well. So it's a shared product between us, hosted here at UNL on our website. The Drought Monitor website has on average 12.5 million hits a year. That has some year-to-year variance and month-to-month variance depending on what's going on with drought in different areas. During more significant drought events, people do tend to look at our website more often. The Drought Monitor is used in several different USDA programs. It's used by the IRS for tax deferrals, and there are other programs that also have started to use the US Drought Monitor in different official capacities. When we're creating the map, we are aware of these different uses, but our primary goal as authors, our sole goal is to create as accurate of a map as possible, independent of those. So we're going to get into what the different color-coded categories mean on the map now. So again, we have 5 different names ranging from abnormal dryness, or D0, all the way down to exceptional drought, or D4. So there are 2 ways statistically to kind of think about what these mean. First is drought rarity. So if you look on the right column, the different levels of drought, you can think of abnormal dryness as something that you'd expect if it's commonly reoccurring to occur maybe once every 3 to 5 years. You can think of it in another way as maybe 20 to 30% of the time, and we'll get into what that means in a minute. And as you go progressively down through the more severe drought levels, you'd expect them to occur progressively more and more rarely. So when you get to your D3 and D4 levels, and even to some extent D2 levels of drought, those are by definition pretty rare events. In terms of exceptional drought, we're looking at maybe a once to twice per century type of drought. These are the rarest of the rare droughts for any given location. Said another way, if you're familiar with percentiles from standardized tests that you may have taken as a kid, or looking at heights of people between common age groups, you're often going to communicate statistics like that in terms of percentiles. So if you have 100 years maybe of some sort of weather data and you want to rank those, the wettest or driest is going to be the first or 100th percentile of that, and so on. So we're taking a bunch of different types of data and looking at the percentiles of those. The different categories that you see on the map represent effectively the percentile of drought conditions that a particular area has settled on. We'll get into how we calculate that shortly here. So pardon me for a moment. We're going to do a relatively simple example here to start to illustrate the point of how we calculate percentiles and then convert that to drought data. So let's imagine that we have a weather station where we have 100 years of data. So as long as there are no ties, we can give each of those individual data points, say rainfall amounts each year, a ranking. Now, when we're going through those rankings, let's say that we're going to assign a drought category for each of those. In reality, it's far more complex because we're using all sorts of different types of data, and we'll go through what those are in a minute. But to illustrate the point, if we were only determining drought based on annual precipitation, what this weather station would look like then is the lowest precipitation amounts occurred in 1950 and 2020. So those would be your exceptional drought years, so to speak. Your third, fourth, and fifth driest years, 1934, 2012, and 1956, would be the extreme drought years. Don't remember for sure off the top of my head which weather station this is. I think it might be Norman, Oklahoma. Either way, the primary point is we're always pulling the drought categories that we're assigning from the percentiles of the data used to describe the meteorological, hydrological climate conditions going on. So kind of just restating a few of the things that we went through. So that was an example using just precipitation data. Percentiles are nice because you can apply percentile methodology to really any data that you can rank through some sort of time series or series of data across some population of things. So percentiles are then nice because we can apply that to really most types of weather or climate or hydrology parameters that we'd want to. We can apply them to all sorts of different drought indicators and drought indices, climate and weather indices, regardless of the length of the data record that we have. So we can apply percentiles if we have 200 years of data in theory. We could do it if we have 100 years of data, 50 years of data, or even shorter periods. There are some drawbacks to keep in mind when we're talking about that, but really any data set like that you can compute percentiles for, which allows us to, in a consistent manner, put drought in historical perspective for any given location. Or said another way, how many expected drought occurrences for different levels would you expect in a given period of time for the type of data that we're considering? So putting it all together then into the US Drought Monitor map, the Drought Monitor is an attempt to represent all different types of droughts on a single map, which is a little bit difficult given how many different types of droughts there are and the different types of data and different time scales of data that we can use to look at those. So I'm not going to go through too much detail on what each of these are, but suffice it to say on the right side, you'll see the meteorological down to socioeconomic drought. Generally speaking, as you go down through these categories, you're looking at longer term drought scales and different types of impacts as you go through those longer terms of drought. And therefore, you're going to be looking at slightly or significantly different sets of data to describe each of these. And so when we put that all together as authors to make the map, and we'll get into shortly what that process looks like week to week, we're using an approach that we refer to as convergence of evidence. So basically, we're looking at different physical data, indicators, and the statistics that go with them at different points in the water cycle and allowing those to converge on a single drought severity level. Usually that's not going to work that cleanly where different types of data, different time scales of data are not going to all give us the same range of percentiles. That would be simpler than reality if it worked that way. So how do we deal with that? We're looking at what type of drought we're analyzing. We're looking at short and long term types of drought. We're looking at how many of these different data sets fall into the different ranges of percentiles, which is really important in assigning a category. And we'll get into soon that we're also working with people, experts on the ground, and reports from the public telling us what they're seeing and helping us to analyze these different types of physical data sets, which ultimately drive what you see on the map. So again, we're looking at things as diverse as precipitation, deficits, and surpluses over multiple periods of time, as short as a few weeks to as long, in some cases, as a few years. We're looking at modeled and observed soil moisture. We're looking at impacts that are reported. We're looking at satellite information regarding vegetation health and how that relates to different weather and climate variables. We're looking at evaporative demand models, basically how much water is being lost due to unusually warm, dry, or windy conditions from the ground. We're looking at observed stream flow from stream flow gauges that the US Geological Survey deploys and looking at percentiles of that data. And finally, we also do look at reservoir and groundwater levels while keeping in mind the human usage of these things as well. And I just want to reiterate, the primary things that drive the map are the percentiles of these different data sets. So impact information alone is not going to drive changes to the map, but it does help inform how we analyze these different statistics. So yeah, drought impacts are part of the drought puzzle, but they're just a part because they drive our analysis of the physical statistics. What do? They impact reports provide evidence that drought is occurring or is not, can help alert the national author and people on a more local level to hotspots that may need additional analysis, can help us to and validate physical indices and indicators that we look at. You can think of it as we're basically using impact information to critically analyze the mathematical data. Can help us identify the type of drought that's going on, or maybe there are multiple types of drought going on at the same time by knowing how it's impacting people. Related to that, it can help us discern between whether a drought is primarily short or long term in nature. And it can assist in severity classification by kind of pointing our attention to different drought indices that are describing what impacts are occurring, but by itself, the impact information will not change the map. So to help us as national authors analyze both the objective data and some of the impact data that people submit to us, we work with all the physical indicators and indices that we put into mapping software each week. And then we also work with local experts such as state climatologist offices or National Weather Service meteorologists, climatologists, lots of different people on a state and local level who will work together to pretty much submit changes that they'd like to see on the map and reasoning for those changes based on the physical data and the impacts that go with that. And people on a local level will have more generally local knowledge of how the local climate, ecosystems, and different things react to drought or lack thereof. Whereas me living in Lincoln, Nebraska, I've lived in different parts of the plains and Midwest, but I may not have a great understanding of how a landscape in Oregon or Maine or Florida reacts to drought. So it's really helpful to have people on a local level who can help analyze that type of data. Finally, by taking into account all this different information, rather than using a single drought index or indicator like the example for the PDSI from the 80s, we're using a hybrid approach and trying to take as much information as we reasonably can analyze into account when we're making the map. So as we're doing this, we're always trying to improve the drought monitor process. There are different projects that we're working on to discover new types of data we can use, different types to blend that data together. And it's a continuous development process. So we take feedback from different experts in our field on on what things we should be developing and keep working at that from there. All right, so practically speaking, what does this process actually look like week to week? So the map production process, you start preparing the data and bringing in data. We have a GIS team here at the National Drought Mitigation Center that assists with that on Monday morning, where all those different physical indices and indicators, some of it raster data, some of it point data, we're all loading that into GIS software. We use ArcGIS Pro currently. And so we have to see all that physical data first before we can start making edits to the previous week's map, which we also have based on that information. And so then we start turning off and on layers of data such as snow water equivalent tied up in snowpack, precipitation deficits and surpluses over different time periods, humidity information, evapotranspiration information, evaporative demand, stream flow information, soil moisture and groundwater information, vegetation health, lake and reservoir levels, and I'm probably forgetting a few things here. In effect, we're looking at data across the water cycle and all of those different indices and indicators that we can turn percentiles of on and off in our map as we adjust the analysis. And because of the different types of data we're looking at, and because we're looking at different points in the water cycle, we're inherently analyzing drought on really short-term timescales, such as a matter of several days to a few weeks, out to sometimes really multi-annual type of drought signals that we'll see. And again, we're looking at different types of information for that. Multi-annual drought might look like you see, given certain types of geology, significant groundwater deficits and lake levels and reservoir levels, in some cases may be very low. Your long-term precipitation deficits are going to show a signal that it's pretty dry if you're looking at for long-term drought, whereas short-term drought, you're going to look at more short-term precipitation deficits. Deficits in soil moisture is the evaporative demand over the last several weeks to a few months higher than normal. Maybe stream flow comes into account too. So different things like that. So over the past decade or so, we do have several different types of data that we've made use of that we didn't have access to in the early 2000s when making the map, that are based on satellite technology that allow us to see things, some of them particularly related to more short-term or flash drought, quickly emerging drought, and then short-term drought signals. Data such as, I'm just going to list a few off here: evaporative stress index. We have our quick dry or quick drought response index. The evaporative demand drought index has a fun name, EDDI, AIRS, a NASA product, and several others that we look at to supplement the in situ or on-site measurements that we have of different quantities. We also like to use remotely sensed data. So as part of the process, there are a few different roles that citizen science can take. So I did kind of see in the chat that many people who have been popping up in the chat have said you're CoCoRaHS observers. First, just want to say as a meteorologist, thank you for being CoCoRaHS observers. Drought is one of the many different applications, but not the only one, in which these daily precip observations are super helpful. So in having in situ precipitation measurements from people such as CoCoRaHS observers is a very helpful supplement to the other types of precipitation data that we use, usually on its own, because we don't have the whole historical context from which we can calculate different statistical indices from that data. It's not going to change the map on its own, but again, it's a helpful supplement to help fill in radar holes, give us another eye on what's falling on the ground, what's not making it to the ground. It's always helpful to have more measurements. Relatedly, we also have our Seymour drought system, and I believe you can submit drought impacts on CoCoRaHS as well, where we're looking for people to send pictures, descriptions of drought conditions or lack thereof in their area, and hopefully these can be somewhat regular submissions as well. And again, that helps us to supplement and better understand the different physical indices and indicators, statistics that we're looking at when making the map. So a lot of talk of data. We do have an online PDF that we release, and we're working on updating this, where we release some of the different maps that we do look at as authors. And it's, if you looked at all the different types of data sets and all the different associated time scales that we tend to look at as authors, you're going to end up with 150 plus maps, which is a lot for any one person or a single author, and then people on the local level to analyze. So one thing that we have been doing recently, pardon me for a moment, is working on these combined drought indices or blend data. And so this is taking advantage of recent machine learning technology where we can take different types of data that we look at, such as precipitation, balance between precipitation and evaporative demand, vegetation health, soil moisture data, and we can create these statistical blends as kind of initial first guesses that we can overlay over the previous week's map with their own drawbacks that kind of give us an initial picture of what short-term drought conditions might look like statistically, what mid-term, long-term drought conditions might look like, and then what flash drought conditions look like. It's another tool to help draw our attention to what areas may be getting wetter quickly or what areas may be getting drier quickly. So it's a way to kind of synthesize a lot of the different data sets that we're looking at into more quickly usable information that can then help us to hone in on specific areas to spend more time analyzing. So these are just some examples of our recent blend maps from this week. So if you'd like to see these maps, you can Google NDMC drought blends or go to ndmcblends.unl.edu. We'd be happy to put some of this information in the chat as well, I think, if people are curious. So practically speaking, I've got all of this as an author. I've got all of this different data in the last week's map, and then starting to get emails to filter in from people on a local level with suggestions on the map. So what does that look like? Well, each day, Monday through Wednesday, we're going to send out at least one draft map for that week's map update. And then it's an iterative process where we'll get local feedback from people on a local level to say, hey, we like the changes you made as the national author in this area, or we disagree with these changes based on this set of data. Have you considered X, Y, and Z? Or, hey, we noticed you didn't change this area yet. I think you should change this area because of A, B, and C data. And so we'll iterate on different maps through about midday Wednesday until we come to effectively a consensus on the map. Ultimately, it's the national author's final call on what the map looks like. But again, we're iterating through standardly at least 3 drafts, sometimes several more, over the course of the first half of the week. And so putting that all together, the process is basically you get on Monday the previous week's map and some notes from either yourself the previous week if you were authoring 2 weeks in a row, or the previous author letting you know about areas that you maybe should keep a particular eye on as you start your shift. We're just trying to, as different authors, we communicate frequently, keep each other situationally aware of what's going on in the drought world. So then we'll download data once or several times on Monday until we have all of those data updates. And then we do that again on Tuesday until we get to the data cutoff. So I'll go into that again shortly, but whenever you see the Drought Monitor map, if you go right now to droughtmonitor.unl.edu, you're going to see a map released today on, I believe it's Thursday, February 12th, but the map is going to be valid Tuesday, February 10th. The map is always valid as of early Tuesday morning, meaning we're only considering data through early Tuesday morning. So for example, if heavy precipitation fell somewhere on Tuesday afternoon, that's not going to be considered until the following week's map, because the map that you see online is a snapshot of conditions as of Tuesday morning and the week previous. So as we're weighing all that evidence through Tuesday morning, we create different draft maps each day. We send them out to right now an email list, and the local experts on that email list provide feedback, evaluate the results, tell us what they liked or didn't like about the changes or lack thereof. We keep downloading new data, keep going through that cycle, usually putting in a pretty decent amount of hours for the beginning of the week. I've worked as long as 35 to 40 hours on the Drought Monitor map before during busier weeks. And finally, when you get to the end of that process, we have a written narrative that you can find where we describe what changes were made and at least in some level of detail why. And we send out the data for processing to our team, GIS team and web team here at the National Drought Mitigation Center. So again, want to reiterate, the map is always valid as of Tuesday morning. So the valid release date and the release date itself. And so the map validates always Tuesday morning. The map is almost always released on a Thursday morning, except for cases like Thanksgiving or Christmas. If there are a few cases where there is a Thursday federal holiday in which we'll change up the drought monitor schedule. Finally, once the map is finalized, that's the final map for that week. No changes are made retroactively to the map. The map is updated each week, so changes that were not made a particular week as we continue to look through data, new changes can be considered week to week. We typically, in any particular week, keep changes on the map in either direction to one category. Multiple category improvements do happen on occasion, but it's fairly rare. Usually those require a pretty significant precipitation event that also allows other parts of the water cycle to significantly improve, such as water flowing into soils very efficiently. Multiple category degradations are exceptionally rare. I can count on one hand the number of times that I've done those, and even though we do have flash drought conditions occasionally, the number of times where the majority of data that we look at to analyze the map makes a jump through more than one range of percentiles from one week to the next is pretty rare. And the map is a participatory process between us here at the National Drought Mitigation Center, the USDA, NOAA, and now NASA as well. So we have standard procedures that we collaborate on between these different partners. So we're all using the same methods to make the map. We have calls occasionally, pretty regularly, where we discuss the methodology, any issues that are coming up to make sure that as authors, we're all on the same page for how we do the analysis. You can see on a map here that all the authors are at national or regional center. That's required to be a national author. And we are scattered about different parts of the country too, between the different types of offices. And I did misspeak. You can also be in academia or research, such as us here at the University of Nebraska, Lincoln. So I also mentioned that whenever we're sending out drafts of different drafts of the map. We're sending that out right now to an email list. So you can see on this map just where most of those people are located. Some states have more than others in terms of the number of people on the list, but there is a fairly even scattering of the number of people that we have who are seeing these drafts and providing feedback, or at least seeing the drafts. So some quick concluding thoughts. We're getting a couple minutes over time here, so I'll keep this brief. The drought monitor, it's a snapshot of drought during the week and a particular time. On Tuesday morning, it's not a forecast for data that's going to occur afterwards. So it does not take into account the weather forecast for the week ahead, nor anything that occurred after Tuesday morning. The drought monitor categories you see are communicating specifically the rarity of drought level or the range of percentiles historically that drought locally is falling into. It's a collaborative process where we're trying to look at different types of data and draw different types of experts into the analysis. Related to that, impact information alone does not drive changes on the map. That's the percentiles, but it does help us interpret that percentile data. And given this, sometimes someone is always going to be on the quote wrong side of map lines, but we do make changes every week and we keep ourselves and the next authors aware of different areas to keep an eye on every week. So yeah, I think that's all we have. So I'd like to say thank you to everyone for joining today. I will be on for the next half hour or so to answer questions, as well as my coworkers Brian Fuchs and Dr. Lindsay Johnson, who are also both Drought Monitor authors. So with that, yeah, we'll be happy to start running through any questions you may have.
All right, thank you so much for that, Curtis. We've been answering a few questions in the Q&A, so if you have any that you would like to have answered, please throw it in that Q&A. I'll just start with one that I, as author the last couple weeks, have encountered quite a bit was how do we deal with snow?
That's a great question, Lindsay. So snow, unlike other types of precipitation, primarily rain, obviously does have a usually delayed impact on different parts of the water cycle. So we do consider how much water is tied up in the snowpack when we're authoring the map. That is one of the data types we look at. But we also have to consider that if the ground is frozen and snow is not melting, it's not immediately going to seep into the soil. So it's not going to immediately raise stream flows or increase soil moisture in different areas. So sometimes you will see a delayed impact in the drought monitor map from snowfall. So there is more to be said about that, but that's probably a quick high level overview of that.
And Curtis, just to add to that, I think it also depends on the type of winter we're having. Just using some of the Midwest and Plain states as an example, some earlier snows fell on unfrozen ground. And when that snow did melt, we were able to see the benefit of that snow right away versus saying, oh, it's going to be spring before we see that. So with little frost in the ground, that's where there's really not a hard and fast rule. Every year, every season can be quite different. If we would have been colder earlier and had a decent frost depth already, a lot of that melting snow would have been runoff, and it would have been more of a hydrological impact versus going into any soils or subsoil, groundwater, etc.
That's a great point, Brian. Thank you for bringing that up. That also reminds me that over long periods of time, you can lose a little bit of snowpack occasionally to things like sublimation, evaporation. And when that occurs, that's part of why we're looking at not just precipitation, but how does that snowpack, when it does start to melt, actually impact the conditions that you're seeing and the ground and the streams and the soils? Because it may not always be what you'd expect based on the amount of snow that fell. As you said, it matters when it melts, what the ground conditions are like when it melts, etc.
I think that there was two questions, one from Mary and one from Emily in the Q&A that both were asking about that same topic, either Great Lakes ice and snow cover melt and how do you deal with lack of snow. And again, for many of these areas, the winter season is mainly the driest climatologically speaking. So even when we have drier winters, the overall drought impact, I won't say is minimal, but it is minor compared to when if we have the same dryness or level of dryness during the climatological wetter times of the year. And again, that's going to change depending on what part of the country you're in. But if we're going to have dryness in many locations, the winter is definitely the time, especially through the plains and Midwest. But the folks out west would argue that no, it's our most important time, which we very much do agree with.
Go through here. So we have Emily asking, how do we deal with the lack of snow? I'm assuming that's in areas that are expecting to have snow. is that found in evaporation modeling?
The lack of snow found in evaporation modeling.
So that's a good question, Emily, because basically when we don't have that snow cover, we will continue to lose moisture out of the soils and things like that through the winter months. So yes, it definitely can play into moisture availability later on in the spring when these landscapes are basically snow free throughout the winter. I think that's what you're asking, but we do have different products that are looking at evaporative demand and whatnot within the drought tools that we have.
Yeah, I don't think I have anything to add to that.
Okay. Do we have any data on wetting agents? Not exactly sure if Aaron, you want to extrapolate on that, that'd be great.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with that, unfortunately.
Okay.
Are they able to unmute themselves, Lindsay? Maybe Aaron can
They
just ask.
should be able to unmute themselves.
So Aaron, if you want to unmute yourself and ask what you're getting at there, we'd be glad to try and answer.
Yeah, just curious if there's been any use of, again, just trying to hold the moisture that's coming, with those wetting agents in that soil.
In many in many of the ag areas, the type of tilling that they do, low till, no till, is part of that. Now, if producers are actually putting agents into the soils to help with that, as far as soil moisture storage or helping to reduce loss of soil moisture, that we don't have information on that.
I'm just in the golf industry, so that's just proving to be something that's really helping golf wise. So I just wasn't sure if there was maybe any interest in trying to track some of that data.
No, that's good to know. I'm guessing that the folks in the row crop grain type production would be those that would probably have the most interest or knowledge of that. But again, as Curtis went through the various types of data that we look at, if people are tracking things at very small scales or regional scales, we're hoping that our contributors that we hear from each week during the process of doing the drought monitor map include information like that to us. With the amount of area that we have to cover and the short period of time that we have, if there are regional or even localized efforts going on, that would have to be relayed to us by those in those areas.
Okay. Second time. So from Brent, generally speaking, do we find rapidly growing populations in semi-arid environments becoming more upset when it's arid and having more issues with the map than areas with more abundant or regularly occurring precipitation? Or is water use trending or tending to increase everywhere? It's kind of like a double-sided.
Yeah, I'm not super familiar with water use statistics and trends and over time or regional trends. And
I think this comes into the question of water scarcity, water availability versus drought, which are two different topics. You can have drought in any landscape, but in many areas where the water is being managed or there are specific rules in place as to how water will be used, it is different than what drought is and what's happening on those unmanaged systems, unmanaged ecosystems, etc. So it is a question of what is drought versus water availability, water scarcity, which are parallel but two different questions.
Well, and also, forgive me if Curtis said this and I just missed it. The drought monitor is not a water monitor.
Yeah.
So we're not there to say how much available water there is, but rather, where moisture is lacking in the natural hydrologic cycle, as much as we can differentiate human versus natural.
Well,
right,
another good point on that is even as populations grow, which we have seen in many parts of the US, water consumption per person actually has been declining due to various reasons, various technologies. And we also can have man-made drought where we are basically taking a resource from one area and moving it to another where, you got to start looking at the source regions for some of these surface water supplies as well.
Okay. And then from Alper, we created Uber's H3 hexagon grid-based drought maps instead of square grids to accelerate the calculation process of interpolation and aggregation. What do you think about using hexagonal grids?
From a GIS perspective, I don't have any familiarity with that.
Okay.
The dreaders we're drawing are polygons that then we can interpolate to grids, but I guess I don't know what type of data you're using to do that analysis.
I mean, we're using quarter degree grids on the gridded products we have. We have point data, we have gridded data, et cetera. The satellite products as well that are coming in. The actual grid size or grid dimensions, until I would see a comparison side by side, it's hard to have an opinion one way or the other to know if that actually would impact the analysis that we do.
Yeah, as a quick point of clarification, in case I didn't make this clear during the main part of the talk, the lines each week are human drawn. We are going into our GIS software and moving around vertices, adding shapes, deleting shapes as necessary. So we're doing a human analysis of these different types of pointer raster data that have different resolutions. So.
Okay. Trying to think of any other questions. We have about 12 minutes left. One just popped in. Oh. Yeah, it can be like sometimes very artistic, especially back in the old days when they were using Corel Draw to draw the maps. It's a little more precise now, but it definitely experience, and I'll let Curtis kind of expound on this. Your experience has a lot to do with it. And that's why it's good to have people with very diverse backgrounds of hydrology, climatology, meteorology, because it isn't like you see the data, but you have to use your experience to understand the data.
So my background doing analysis of weather maps, I would be contouring just with a pencil around different types of data, often surface weather station or weather balloon data. What I'm doing as a drought monitor author, and what Lindsay and Brian and others are doing, is in some ways similar to that, where we do have to kind of interpolate around different types of points, and so the level of detail that we can show, the precision that we can show on the map, is tied to the available data that we have and its quality. And that's a reason why you might see some differences in terms of what the precision looks like. Sometimes you just have pretty tight gradients in drought conditions. And oftentimes, again, having local input, as Lindsay alluded to, is important in kind of fine-tuning things when we have data that allows us to justify doing that. So, Brian, anything to add on that?
The old adage from one of the people who developed the drought monitor back in the late 90s is, regardless of where you draw the line on the map, someone is always going to feel that they're on the wrong side of that line. And again, with a data-driven product, we're as good as the data that is given to us. We don't produce the data that we use. Curtis showed a couple data sources that we do produce in-house, but the vast majority of the data is coming from official federal sources, and it's their job to collect these data. And so we're taking these data and using the best available data that we have at a point in time to make a decision. And I always tell people that when I'm the author and my name's on that map, I have to feel comfortable that if anyone calls up and wants me to talk about any area on the map that I did, I need to be able to give them a good explanation as to why the map looks the way it does. So, you know, we're as good as the data that we have. And as data has improved through the years, again, I've been doing this for 20 plus years now. We're definitely getting better with how we draw those lines, and that is technology and data driving that process. And I'll go back. Angie had a question online about a SVI. Angie, if you want to unmute yourself and ask that question, I don't think we know what you're asking. If Angie is still with us. If not, other questions, if you'd like to unmute yourself. Or type it in. I guess for P. Brent Duncan too, it is somewhat of an artistic approach, that it is a hybrid approach where we're using both data and also feedback from the ground. There isn't another process out there that incorporates instantaneous peer review. We go through several draft iterations during a 3-day process where the final map has definitely gone through several sets of eyes and several sets of critique before it's finalized. And so, yes, there is some art to that, but it is data driven. At the very end, it is where the data are showing the differences on the map. So we do have a few more minutes. It looks like we're caught up on questions, but you do have our ears, and again, these questions have been very good. You know, we do our best to try to cover these types of questions, as we've done quite a few of these Drought Monitor 101 sessions. And so we've been taking these questions that we've seen come up over time and incorporating them into the presentation. But, you know, one thing to also remember is our ears are always open. If you have a comment, question, concern, you can shoot us an email or a phone call, and we'll be glad to have that conversation with you.
Absolutely. And I guess while we try and close out, again, unmute yourself or type in a question if you have one. We will be having another USDM 101 webinar with the Q&A in May. If you're interested in joining again, or you think of other people who might be interested, if you want to go ahead and send them that link. We'll also be sending out some emails to promote it as well. Our goal is basically to get the information of how it is made, what it is, to as many people as possible, so that way it can be used and understood by more people is ultimately our goal. Every people all the way from policymakers to individual ranchers use our products. So we want to make sure that the correct information is out there.
And quickly, Lindsay, while we do have a few minutes, I think one kind of hot topic that's been coming up has been the lack of snow through much of the western U.S. this year. And really, what does that mean later on? You know, we may not see the impact of that immediately, but we've already started hearing from resource managers, decision makers, state climate offices, et cetera, that, you know, what happens the rest of this snow accumulation season, which typically goes through the end of March, sometimes later. But typically, some of the impacts that we're seeing from this lack of snow that has been pretty widespread throughout much of the West this winter is going to be more of a kind of delayed drought in a way, because we're not really going to see the impact until we see exactly what happens from the lack of runoff, the lack of water going into storage facilities, reservoirs, or even the lack of water for irrigation for summer crops later on. So again, it's one of those topics that it's very pertinent to this winter, as much of the country has seen below normal snowpack, especially in the mountainous regions. And we're kind of learning to see what is that going to mean. And it's going to really be determined on, what kind of antecedent conditions took place prior to winter in these different mountainous areas across the country.
While we're on, I did put in a few links to some of the different citizen science and local input data that we referred to, especially CocoRa's and our Seymour system. So please feel free to reach out to us, your local National Weather Service office, your local state climate office. If you have questions about any of these, we'd love to get more observers who are telling us what's going on drought and precip-wise on the ground.
All right. I guess with that, we will thank you all for spending an hour with us, getting to know the process a little bit more. And you all have a wonderful day.